I had got interested in climate change in a big way. I'd say the seed for the idea was really sown in a way in 2016, soon after I arrived in India, where I was the FT's Mumbai correspondent. And I wrote an article looking at droughts in the west of India. And it was very clear to me, looking at the temperature records, speaking to the farmers, speaking to meteorologists, that things were changing in Western India. And you had very severe droughts, which was driving a very tragic wave of suicides among farmers. Mm-hmm. And this shocked me. I walked along bone-dry reservoirs that were completely empty of water, through fields where farmers had to abandon their crops. And for the first time in this way, it really struck me, this is not about the future. This is about the present. This is not something that our grandchildren will have to worry about. This is something that people are grappling with right now, and which is already devastating people's lives and livelihoods.
Hello and welcome to Say Hi to the Future, the podcast aimed at highlighting the human side of human ingenuity, clever, inventive, and original thinking. My name is Ken Tenser, curator of Say Hi to the Future and CEO of SpyderWorks, a leading business consultancy for mid-market organizations and entrepreneurs globally. With me today is Simon Mundy. He is currently the moral money editor at the Financial Times, where he reports on the push towards a more sustainable world economy. He began his reporting career in Johannesburg, where he covered South Africa for the FT before a period writing on the London financial sector. He then spent 7 years in Asia, heading the FT bureaus in Seoul and Mumbai, before 2 years traveling through 26 countries on 6 continents to research Race for Tomorrow, a book on the global scramble to respond to climate change. Like this video if you enjoy our show, and subscribe to our channel. Leave us a comment with who we should interview next. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the show. Simon, welcome to Say Hi to the Future.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we talk a lot about passion, curiosity, audacity. I'm going to start with a curious question. I've been an entrepreneur 27 out of my 35 years in business, and you are now the editor of Financial Times section called Moral Money. 2 words that I haven't heard together very often in business. So please tell us what moral money is and why the Financial Times is championing it.
Yeah, so I think it reflects a broader shift that's been happening within business, which is this rapidly growing focus on the social and environmental impacts of business and finance. I think for a long time, this was not seen as something that was core to business and core to business journalism. Of course, principles like stakeholder capitalism have been there for a very long time. But it was felt, I think, by many people in business, many people in the media, that this was something which was sort of just worthy talk, which people paid lip service to, but wasn't really a powerful force in itself in business. Now, something has changed there, and it's changed relatively recently and very, very rapidly. So the FT wanted to make sure that we were covering this as fully and comprehensively and deeply as possible, because our readers feel they need to know about it. And this is one of those subjects, actually, where readers aren't only reading about this because they're curious about it. In many cases, people in business, we have many business people, not entirely business people, but many business people among our readers, they want to read about this because they know that it's really important to their work. And increasingly, if you're a business person, a business leader, and you're not up to date with what's happening in this space, you're putting yourself and your business at risk, potentially, because it's a fast-moving space. Regulation is changing fast. Investor demands are changing. Consumer demands are changing. So that's what we try to address through Moral Money in particular. So Moral Money is really, it's twice weekly, going up to 3 times weekly next week, actually, newsletter, and also published on the website, of course, looking at the intersection of environmental and social issues with global business and finance. Set up a couple of years ago. Huge interest and support from readers all over the world, because, as we were saying, this is simply a big issue that people really feel they need to know about.
That's very cool. So, and you talk about the space, and you've been at it for a few years now. What are some of the specific topics or some of the articles that might have resonated best, just so I get, maybe a deeper, clearer understanding of what I, as a business person or leader, I would read about or interact with daily or a few times a week?
Yeah, there's a huge range of things, of course, covered in the universe. But to give you a sense of some of the hottest topics, executive pay, which has been rocketing up. Now, CEOs have always been paid more than entry-level workers, but the ratio has absolutely skyrocketed to hundreds of times, from far more modest levels, say 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Right.
So that's one of the things that we've started looking at. Can a company be considered socially responsible if its CEO is paid tens of millions of dollars a year? We're not necessarily taking an explicit campaigning position on this, but we're asking the question because people increasingly think that's a question that needs to be asked. If we look at the carbon offset market, that's another really hot one that we're very interested in, because it might sound quite specific, but when you think about it, all these companies are saying we're going to become net zero. What does net zero mean? It means that you're going to have gross emissions. You will still be emitting something from your activities and your broader business operations, but you're going to offset that. That's why it's called net. But how do you offset it? And that market at the moment, according to most experts who seriously analyze the space, it's not fit for purpose. You can go out and buy a certificate that says you have offset X tons of carbon emissions, but it's not a properly regulated market. And according to many experts, you really can't trust what's written on those certificates. So these are some of the issues that we're looking at. I mean, there are so many more, but we're particularly interested in the questions where it's complicated, where it's not as simple as just breaking it down into heroes and villains. Because in many of these cases, these are rapidly evolving issues where the correct answers are not yet totally obvious.
You know what I love about that? I mean, other than the obvious importance today, we talk a lot about active or shareholder activists or activist shareholders in business and around governance and what they've done or what the pressures that they put on boards and companies. But I'm a father of 3 kids that are all in their 20s. And there's a generational activism and generational stakeholders now who, whether or not they're strong investors, they're definitely brand advocates or not brand advocates. And they really truly understand and look for brands and companies to work with, to buy from, to build relationships with that are moral, that are looking at and thinking about the things that you are. So I think for companies, not just at the board or governance level, understand that new wave of consumerism and what really drives them.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think you could even go beyond that and say, why is there so much more focus on climate change than there was a few years ago? When I started research for my book, Race for Tomorrow, in 2017, at that time, climate change was far less prominent in the global conversation than it is now. And I do think, and I think, most analysts of this space also think that one of the big things that changed that was the emergence of this extraordinary new wave of youth activism, right. People, young people, in many cases, children, marching and campaigning for serious climate action. So, as you say, it's having an effect on the business landscape directly in terms of young people as consumers, but I think it's also having a powerful political impact. If we look at the rise of green votes, the green parties in Europe, a lot of analysts are saying actually it seems like there's actually children are having an impact in the elections. They can't vote, but they sure as hell can lobby their parents. And that seems to be happening. So I totally agree with you. I think one of the big things that's shifting the landscape is the emergence of this young generation. And businesses can't ignore it, because not only are these their next generation of consumers, but it's also their employees. And you see a lot more internal activism happening within companies. Companies are worried that it's difficult for them to attract the right sort of talent if they don't have the right reputation for sustainability. Oil companies are finding it increasingly hard to get the sort of talent that they used to get. So these are all very big issues that any business leader needs to be thinking very seriously about.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you nailed it too. I mean, that song in the past, or that story in the past was, well, if they're not 18, they can't vote. Boy, they not only is the next generation voting, I think they're the greatest generation of advocates, and they have the largest platform in the world. So whatever it is that we do, whatever walk of life, I think we really have to mind the voices of the future and who we're leaving the planet for.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's something which I hope will drive the right level of political action. Because we've seen it feeding through into election results. In Europe, for example, you look at the performance of the Green Party in Germany, for example, and we do see it feeding through into an accelerating pace of climate action in Europe. Now you have an American government, US government that is trying to drive action, but obviously they have issues in Congress that make it complicated. And that's the big question. I think it's encouraging to see that pressure. But frankly, I don't think there's yet enough pressure for the kind of action that we really need. I think if you look at what came out of COP26 in Glasgow, yes, it was dramatically more productive than the previous COP 2 years earlier in Madrid. But the fact is, if you compare it with what's needed, we're still falling way short.
Yeah. Well, and you address this, I mean, not just in your work with FT, but you've got a brilliant new book, Race for Tomorrow. And 26 countries, 2 years, 6 continents, traveling. Much of it, I understand, during the pandemic. I wish I could deliver that like Graham Norton, because it really sounds like a crazy undertaking when you did it. So tell us a little bit about the experience, and then of course the substance and the importance of the work in the book.
Absolutely, yeah. So the idea, as I mentioned, it was way back in 2017 that I first had the idea, and I had got interested in climate change in a big way. I'd say the seed for the idea was really sown in a way in 2016, soon after I arrived in India, where I was the FT's Mumbai correspondent, and I wrote an article looking at droughts in the west of India. And it was very clear to me, looking at the temperature records, speaking to the farmers, speaking to meteorologists, that things were changing in Western India. And you had very severe droughts, which was driving a very tragic wave of suicides among farmers. Mm-hmm. And this shocked me. I walked along bone dry reservoirs that were completely empty of water, through fields where farmers had to abandon their crops. And for the first time in this way, it really struck me, this is not about the future. This is about the present. This is not something that our grandchildren will have to worry about. This is something that people are grappling with right now, and which is already devastating people's lives and livelihoods. So it was sometime after that I had the idea for the book. And the idea for the book was really to try to do justice to the extraordinary drama and color and human narrative force about what's happening within this story. I think very often people think of the climate crisis as being something rather huge and abstract. And often they see it as being very depressing, very dry, sort of intimidating. And I thought, well, for one thing, that's completely understandable because that's how I had seen it to a certain extent. But I thought, actually, you don't have to present these stories in such a way. Fundamentally, this is a story about people's responses, and many of these responses are very inspiring. The toughness that people are showing, the ingenuity and resourcefulness and sheer hard work that people are showing. So I wanted to do justice to that. I wanted to write a climate book that would read to a certain extent like a travel book. This is a journey through a world in flux. This is a journey through one of the great transformations in global history. And it's focused on the people who are in the thick of it, and a huge range of them, from those farmers in India, for example. I mean, that forms the basis of one of the book's chapters. I also met mammoth tusk hunters in Siberia, clean energy billionaires in China and the US, winemakers in Chile, cobalt miners in Congo, people from the South Pacific to Mongolia. It's really about bringing across the sheer scale and diversity and really compelling nature of some of these human responses, bringing these tales to life. And that was the idea behind it. So it was 2 years of full-time travel. The COVID pandemic broke out halfway through, as you mentioned. Fortunately, I was able to keep traveling to all of the countries that I wanted to go to. I had already been to China, for example, and Australia. So I had already, because those countries, of course, closed the borders. And the countries that I still wanted to go to, I managed to get to all of them and tell the stories of the people that I met. And I'm really excited to see that people who have read the book do feel that it really brings the subject to life and helps you to get a handle on what is a complicated subject through the stories of these very extraordinary people that I met all over the world.
Yeah. Well, no, I love that. And I think what I've found so important about your approach, and honestly, it's something I've said for many years, is that those who can make the complex accessible are our best communicators and really are the key to the future. Because, saying to people that, I don't know, Earth is going to change, the sea level is going to rise, this is going to happen. As you said, it really is obtuse. But when you bring it down to the here and now and the individuals and their stories, that's when I think we step back and as I was reading through some of the stories, step back and go, okay, that's real to me. Now I understand how that's, I'm not saying it's impacting me that way in Canada, but I can understand how it's impacting a single human in humanity. So to me, that was a wonderful approach.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think what was interesting to me was, as a journalist, to let people tell their stories. So, for example, there's one person I met in the book. His name was Ezio, and I met him when he was in the process of burning down a section of the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. I was traveling down a road with Marco, who was my sort of research partner in Brazil. He's a former special forces soldier who had engaged in fighting against illegal gold miners in the Amazon and so on. And he's become a biologist. He's discovered 7 new species of fish in the Amazon. Extraordinary person to work with. And I should say that, the reason I dedicated this book to all the people who contributed to it is because, so many different people supported me in this project in all sorts of ways. Anyway, so Marco and we saw this enormous plume of smoke coming from the middle of the jungle. And we were curious, we followed it, and we drove as far as we could, and then we walked. And in the middle of all this smoke, we found Ezio, who was this guy in his mid-20s with one good eye and a baseball cap and a torn red jersey and a machete and a jerry can, who was burning down this patch of forest, smoldering ashes and lumps of wood and flames, quite a hellish scene, really. And there he was with his enormous machete, so it was quite an intimidating sight. But we went and spoke to him, and we were very upfront, and we said, that I was a journalist, I was researching a book. Could we speak to him? And what was interesting was that he was very happy to talk. He was happy to be photographed. He was happy to be filmed. You can see him if you go to my YouTube channel to search for Simon Mundy on YouTube. There's a video of Ezio just talking about why he's burning down the rainforest. And that shows you the level of impunity that has set in. Now you have this very conservative president, Jair Bolsonaro, who has really presided over a period of lawlessness in the Amazon. Mm-hmm. But so if you read the way that I described Ezio in the book, I really just presented his story. I mean, he made the point, it's easy for you from your rich country to condemn people like me for doing this, but I have a choice. I can either be poor or I can burn down a section of rainforest to grow cattle, because cattle farming is how you make money. And I felt that what I could add through this book was rather, it's not a polemic as you've seen it. It's a collection of stories. I'm not saying there's no place for polemic. There are some brilliant polemics out there on the climate crisis, but my skill set is as a reporter. My job is really to get out there, meet interesting people, find the information, and just share it with the readers and allow them to make up their own minds. And so you can see that with my approach to Ezio. You can see that with the chapter on Saudi Arabia or the chapter in Australia. And I think a lot of people do appreciate that, actually, because this has been such a heavily politicized subject. And I think a lot of people have felt a bit overwhelmed by the very forceful and heated rhetoric on various sides of this debate. So I wanted to simply take the reader on a journey through these extraordinary places, meeting these extraordinary people, and let you make up your own mind.
So the first thing that comes to mind, through your 2 years of travel and the stories and what we all hear is, how can there be doubters anymore? How can people just not see what is right in front of everyone's eyes and very real experiences?
Yeah, I mean, there's a section of the book where I deal with that quite explicitly in Nepal, where I climbed it. It took me 5 days to hike up to a glacial lake. And this glacial lake is one of thousands that have been appearing in the Himalaya, created by the rapid and accelerating melting of glaciers, which create these lakes that are a fearsome danger to the people who live in the slopes beneath them. And this could be danger spread over a very large distance, because if it's a lake at the top of a mountain, then the resulting flood could travel a very long way. So beneath this lake, this is one of the largest in all the Himalaya. It's called Chorolpa. It's about 50 kilometers west of Mount Everest. And there's a little village right next to it, just below it, called Nagaon. Very small, a few dozen people living there. And speaking to the people there, it was extraordinary that they lived there with this lake, which could burst out at any time, because, the pressure is growing. There's just this very sort of flimsy wall of rock. It's called a moraine at the end of the lake, and it could burst. And all the time in other parts of the Himalaya, this is happening. And there was one lady in particular that I spoke to called Fodiki, who was in her 70s. She'd lived her whole life in this village, and she had seen the lake growing, because she used to take her animals up there as a young girl, and she'd been going up there ever since. And she had seen year after year this lake growing and growing. But she told me, look, the scientists have been saying this lake could burst out at any time. But I've been living here for 70 years and it's never burst out. I think it's fine. And around that time, I was reading a book by a university professor and ecologist in Texas, who's very prominent in the ecological field, called Timothy Morton. And he has this book called Hyperobjects. And in that book, he argues that things like climate change in particular, climate change is something on a scale so enormous so hugely distributed in time and place that we're just not really equipped to deal with it. And that's why it's quite difficult for us to really come to terms with the scale of what it implies for our world, our economy, our personal lives. So in a way, the way that Fodiki was viewing that lake, it seemed to me to reflect the way that all of us look at climate change as a whole, or at least the way that we're most predisposed to. It takes an effort to imagine the sheer scale of what's in store. And it's difficult because, we haven't really evolved to think in such terms. You can walk out of your place in the morning and unless a serious disaster is underway, and certainly if you live in one of the more temperate parts of the world, you might not even notice the potential horror of what's in store. So it does take an effort. It's not a matter of simply, you read some data and then you can internalize that and generate the required level of concern about it. I do think because nothing like this has happened in human history. We have never in our thousands and thousands of years of human evolution changed the climate in this way. We're not used to thinking in this way, but we have to make that effort. And what's encouraging is that more and more people are getting out of their comfort zone and getting to grips with it. You're right that there are still people who do reject the science. Unfortunately, that's particularly conspicuous in the US. I think the US is, a real outlier in that regard, obviously. But I think even there, that's on the decline quite markedly. I think it's becoming more and more difficult to deny what's happening. I mean, just look at the disasters that hit the US last year, and that's just the latest of several years of consecutive severe disasters. I think things like that mean that denialism is on the decline, but it's still a concern, and especially in the US, as I said.
Well, we had our last conference in Columbus, Ohio, our last Say Hi, our Human Ingenuity Conference. We do these sort of ingenuity challenges, and they're all blind challenges. You go into the room, you don't know who you're going to be with or what you're discussing. And one of them was on climate change. And what we just do is we ask people or encourage people to think differently about this topic with people that they have never met before. And one of the really interesting things in terms of communicating or understanding it was a bit of a revelation for them, was a sense that, the Earth is not going anywhere. Humanity has only been large. It's only, forget 8 billion. It's only been 1 billion or more for what, century and a half. Very, very, very short period of time out of the millions or whatever number of years it's been around. So it's not the Earth that is suffering, it's humanity that's suffering. And the Earth is just finding a way to pare down and make itself healthy again. And it was funny because I think it was one of the first times where we didn't see or talk about it as climate or environment, but will there be half of us living here? Will we have grandchildren? Will it be tenable for us to have grandchildren or great grandchildren? And that was an incredible wake-up call in the room.
Yeah, and I think that sort of conversation is happening more and more. It's something I think Pete Buttigieg, the US Transportation Secretary, put this well at COP. He said, we have to stop talking about saving the planet. We have to focus. You have to reframe this as saving lives, because the planet, as you said, the planet is always going to be there, and it's not just humans, of course. Biodiversity is being destroyed massively, but we have to wake up to the fact that this is a threat to all of us, not only in terms of the direct impacts, but also the indirect ones. So the direct impacts will hit developing countries worst of all. They'll hit rich countries also. But one of the things that I think everyone needs to bear in mind is the knock-on effects, such as climate-driven migration. What does that mean for politics in Europe, for example? We've already seen the Syrian civil war, which, by the way, followed the worst drought on record in that country, drove a huge flow of refugees towards Europe, which was seized upon by fascist political parties. Far-right political parties from England to France to Hungary seized upon this to whip up xenophobic feelings, saying, vote for us and we'll keep out the foreigners. Now, I think there is a very high risk that if climate change gets very, very much worse, you will have enormous numbers of people. The World Bank predicts that well over 100 million people will be on the move in the next couple of decades, thanks to climate change. So this is something which is already underway. It's going to get worse, and it will have implications for all of us. But I do think, you sort of alluded to something which is becoming more and more common, which is the focus on population size. Personally, I'm a bit uneasy when I hear people saying that they don't plan to have children because of the climate crisis. That to me is a very bleak way of responding. I don't think the fundamental problem here is that we have too many people on the planet. I think it's perfectly possible to imagine a far more sustainable world with the same number of people, just living in a different way, with an economy that relies on different sources of power, with different incentives that guide the way we all act. And I think it's especially important not to point the finger at relatively high birth rates in the developing world, because, for example, if you look at the rates of carbon emissions in Ethiopia, it's about 1/150th of the per capita emissions in the US. So however many people a country like Ethiopia or Nigeria has, that is not the biggest fundamental problem that's driving the climate crisis. So I think we need to stay focused on what the real issues are.
Absolutely. And Simon, we don't have too much longer together today, but there's one part of the book and one part on your site that I was looking at, and that's the discussions you had in Saudi Arabia. Aramco, I mean, one of the largest energy producers or companies in the world, and now they're focusing on a low carbon global economy. To me, that was fascinating. We've talked about, some of the more remote exchanges that you've had. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because that seems to be, in some ways, right at the heart of carbon emission and the whole issue at hand.
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the most fascinating parts of the research for me personally. I had not been to Saudi Arabia before. I had access to some very, very senior people within the government. Prince Abdulaziz, the energy minister, we spent over 3 hours in a two-way conversation, him just really getting into this vision of what the future of the country could be like. And also visiting Aramco, which, as you say, is the biggest oil company in the world. They pump 12 million barrels of oil every day. It's phenomenal scale. And oil has always been at the heart of the Saudi economy. Well, I say always. I mean, for many, many decades, oil was discovered by American prospectors in the 1930s, and since then, it's really been the bedrock of everything that happens there. We have to remember how unusual the Saudi political system is. It's an absolute monarchy. It's not a constitutional monarchy like the UK or other European countries. This is one family running the show. And they've been able to do that using the oil money. That is what enables them to provide relatively good public services to people, and relatively good sort of financial support to the population, and also to fund a very, very powerful military and police system which protects their rule. But all of that is now under threat as the world starts to move beyond oil. The electric vehicle market is growing far more rapidly than could have been imagined even 5 years ago. Tesla is by far the world's most valuable car company. I mean, all of this is way beyond expectations, even very recently. And so this, I think, is really ramping up the urgency on the Saudi government's part to think, well, our current setup is not sustainable in the long term. And I do think that they're taking this seriously, not because I think they've suddenly developed green hearts, but because anyone can see that the current level of oil demand is not going to be sustained over a very long time. So what do they do about it? One thing that they're investing in quite heavily and to an increasing extent is solar power. They do have an extraordinary solar resource, second to none in the world. It's an incredibly sunny country, so they want to make the most of that. They want to use their solar power to make green hydrogen. Green hydrogen means you're making hydrogen using electrolysis, so from water and green electricity. They also hope to make hydrogen from their natural gas. That's a lot more controversial because it can involve continuing carbon emissions. But they absolutely say, yeah, I mean, we've been an energy superpower in the oil age, and we want to be an energy superpower in the new energy age. But the problem is that the comparative advantage that they obviously had with these enormous and very, very cheap oil reserves doesn't necessarily apply in the same way when it comes to renewable energy. But one thing I would say about Saudi Arabia, which they told me, and I think they have a point on this, this phrase "last man standing" kept on coming up because Saudi Arabia has the cheapest cost of oil production in the world. So even if oil demand comes down a lot, higher costs producers, such as in Canada, for example, or Venezuela, I mean, these are countries with very high cost of oil production. Those countries would start to drop out of the market because if the oil price falls, then they won't be able to compete anymore. But Saudi Arabia might just be the last one left. But they realize that they can't bank on that. Even under such a scenario, if the oil price is lower, then their revenues would be a hell of a lot lower. If everyone in the world is just scrambling to pump as much oil as they can while they can, this is not something that can be relied upon. So they've got a tough spot to deal with. They say they're going to come through it with flying colors. A lot of other people are more skeptical. We'll have to wait and see.
Simon, thank you for that. And Simon Mundy, thank you for being on today. You know, you are the editor of Moral Money for the Financial Times, a great new book, Race for Tomorrow, about climate change. And again, I just love the fact that you spent 2 years going across 26 countries, 6 continents, getting some very real high impact stories about, about climate change and how it becomes accessible to your readers and to humanity. So thank you so much again for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.